There we go. Sorry, I had that in my face. Hello, and welcome to Repost and Riposte. Kind of talk about, as you can see, creating simple training exercises for LED Saber. The reason I'm going to go into that is I had a question from somebody in the community. I'm just going to say Jeff. I'm not going to go from there, just to keep people's privacy, but ask for basically simple routines for beginners, something to do alone at home that's repetitive and trains the mind and hands to work together. Um, and talking about different things like in certain martial arts that's known as katas or drills or whatever you want to call it, right? So I decided to kind of approach this in a different way. I'm going to make this a two-parter, but basically this is going to be, and I'm just trying to pull up the chat comments so I'm paying attention to it. Um, Basically, what I'm going to do is talk about talk about what type of research and things you look into to make sure that you are doing the training exercises that are right for you. Now, obviously, going into this sport, this community as a newbie, there's a lot of things to try. There's a lot of different experiences that people have had. It can be very overwhelming, right? So I'm going to approach this from a methodology that I like to explain when I'm doing some teaching in, say, my rapier class, or occasionally teaching at my school's sun sword class, as we call it. Sorry, I'm just pulling up the chat here just so we're clear. All right. So basically, uh, basically, what I want to talk about is Mark has talked about on his show Stand and Stab. Alec has talked about this. I've talked about it a little bit, and so this is kind of a little refresher. And you can go back and you can look at previous episodes and you can see what if there's something there, if you can track that down. And we've talked about a lot of different techniques, specific things you can do, one-handed techniques, two-handed techniques, learning from small sword, saber, all of these different weapons, right? If you're coming into this and you're looking at it, you're like, okay, I just need the basic curriculum, right? Which understandable. If you've never done any martial arts previously, it can be very daunting. So the one thing I'm gonna mention here is that the way I approach it versus the way other people would approach it. Some people approach it and say, okay, let's create a curriculum. I'll say a curriculum, but a formula essentially to help people use this weapon and borrow from those other techniques. But then they use terms like the forms or like shicho and all these things that technically, borrowed from realistic martial arts, but in turn don't necessarily translate as well to a sparring combat sport. They translate much better to a choreographed sport. There's only a few of those forms that actually really would work if you were thinking about them in the context of how they were created. But they were created in a literary sense, right, as opposed to a practical sense. There's all these martial arts manuals and ideologies that have developed over centuries, right? Those were created for a specific purpose to learn a martial art, either empty hand or with a certain weapon, right? If I'm, Mark and I always talk about, things like cold steel, right? This is about fencing with a military saber, right? So it's written in the 19th century, and it's a good resource. And Mark talks about that. Hey, Mark, speak of the devil. Um, and that's important to recognize that those resources are invaluable. And the other thing is that there's lots of other resources that are not books to read. Maybe reading a book is not the best media for you. So lots of options online, right? You can go on YouTube. There's different instructors, different schools that you can learn different things. But in reality, you're probably just wanting the quick, easy methodology to get there. You're not looking for You're not looking to do all that research because you may not be fully committed to this sport yet, and that's understandable. I mean, I am, and I would strongly recommend. But you want to make sure that the investment that you're going to take, you're going to get something out of the investment that you put in, and that's understandable. When you're going to put time and money and other resources that are finite, so that's important. So, yeah, and as Mark says, Cold Steel also has foil, dagger, and great stick. So, so how I'm going to approach this, as I said, I'm going to do this in a two-parter because obviously I'm not in my garage this week. So I'm approaching this in a two-part. I'm going to talk about just how to develop your own particular curriculum that suits you better, um, rather than say, oh, you should do the Myers Square, right? That's an example from Joachim Meyer, a German treatise. I'm not going to suggest that. What I'm going to suggest is here are the things that you should seek out, and then you should grab these certain things. But there are universal elements you should learn in using an LED saber and with outside our sport. And it's just important to understand those universal things. The class I was teaching yesterday had someone who had never, I think they took a longsword class the hour before, and then they just went right into LED saber. And that's always an interesting challenge because people have different backgrounds. In this case, he did not have previous backgrounds that would have informed a weapons-based martial art, right? So in those instances, right, I need to give them training exercises to do at home, right? So the first thing I'm going to just say, there's different different methodologies. What I say is not necessarily going to be correct. It is going to be one way of doing things. There are so many ways to approach this, and I'm just talking about my approach and how you can create your own approach. Because I don't believe in um, specific, hard and fast rules for training. There are certain things that are definitely rules as far as like things you need to follow because they're universal, right? They're just it's how physics works, it's how geometry works, right? There's universal elements of it, but the techniques themselves, how you do them, that is, I approach it more as a tools as opposed to rules. You learn all these different tools, and you put the ones you want into your tool set, ones that are useful to you. What is successful for me is not necessarily successful for the next person, right? What is successful for me is not as successful for Mark. Mark has a completely different way of moving because he has completely different set of circumstances that make him move a certain way, right? And I don't and some things will line up where we will do similar things and some things won't, right? Um how so that's something to keep in mind. So what I'll say, you're just starting out. You maybe went to a TSL meet. It's your first meet, maybe second meet. I don't know. Either way, you've you're still borrowing all your stuff, but maybe you just got the Saber. Not don't have the gear yet. The gear's on order. You're putting that kit together. Takes time. So you need something to do in the meantime, right? You want something to do so you can keep training in the off, and the important thing is that you keep doing that so your muscles are getting used to, cutting and moving around, and you're getting used to these different movements that are common in our sport so you don't injure anything, so you're properly, ready for when you have all the gear to be sparring, right? So what I do, when I think about it, is what first of all, what is my you need to approach it like any other goal setting, right? What is your goal, right? And it needs to be a realistic goal. So if I want to get involved in this sport, brand new to it, when that was me in early 2016, late 2015, early 2016, at the beginning of the Saber Legion, that was the first time I had done a weapons-based martial art. Um, that was me. I didn't know what my goal was, right? I had no idea what was going to happen here. I had the advantage of taking a course with as part of the creation of the Saber Legion in the Bay Area. with Tom Badillo, and that was based on that was LED Saber as applied from British and Scottish single stick. So that was kind of my intro, right? And that was a one-handed approach. So here's the thing: most people aren't going to have access to that kind of expertise. You might just have the expertise that's in your charter. Your charter might be people that started, only a few months prior to you, right? You're a new charter, or you're a very small charter. That's very likely. Or you're in the middle of nowhere and you got you and maybe a friend. So you got to think about what you want to do. So first things, obviously, you need to you think about your offensive maneuvers. And I just mean your basic cuts and thrusts on a basic level. Um, that is the first thing, you want to be working on. We've talked about, I know Mark's talked about creating a PEL, which is a target to hit. It is important to hit something. Hitting at air works with working on your form, but there's a certain the feedback that you get from making contact with an object, even if it's not the actual object you're going to be hitting. It's not a person wearing armor. It's important to get that feedback, so you can make sure that you're calibrated properly, that your technique is proper, that you're not doing something you're going to injure yourself, you're not doing something that's going to injure somebody else when the time being. So start with um, start with that. Essentially, we always want to learn how to crawl before we can walk, right? You know, there are different schools of thought that say, oh, you should do nothing but footwork before you do all that, right? And that could be true as well. So the two things I would say is your, you know, cuts and thrusts, right? On a basic level. And I'm not even talking about a lunge. If you go back in the Repost and Riposte, I did a whole breakdown of how to do a lunge. I would go back to that. I think it was bad TSL habits and how to fix them, talking about lunging. Go back to that episode, look at that. That will break down the basic elements of a simple lunge that is accessible by anyone, regardless of your physical capabilities. As long as you can take a lunging step, a small lunging step, you can do it. There's nothing. This is not a sport fencing lunge where you're lunging so wide and you have to kind of jump, and then your knees have to be trained for it. This is a simple lunge. Um, I wouldn't even start there. I would start with, am I comfortable holding this weapon? How heavy is it, right? Getting used to how it feels when I cut with it, right? And I'm just going to use this because, like I say, I can't film in my garage right now. So that's what the next week stuff is, where I will show a drill or two that could be useful for people. But, right, you're cutting your basic cuts, right? When I say your basic cuts, if you're new to this, you don't know about the basic cuts. But if you look at every martial art with a weapon, regardless of what it is, whether it's knife, whether it's, stick, whether it's some type of sword, a saber, when you're looking at cuts, there are typically universal cuts that exist. And this is across, it doesn't matter what country it's from, the country of origin, it doesn't matter. It's universal, right? So we're talking, as I'm going to say numbers here, but they can be whatever you want, right? And some people have different applications. Some systems have different applications of numbers. So, like, I think right now I'm mirrored. So, just bear with me on that. But essentially, one. So I'm going to try to mirror it back as best I can. So two, and some people say, okay, 3 and 4, you're ascending cut. So there's the descending cut, the ascending cut, side cuts, right, where you're cutting at the torso or possibly at the shoulder or arm, and then there might be a swipe up, there might be a swipe down, depending on the system. Other systems also have a thrust forward, whether that be usually in a two-handed system. But if you look at those basic things, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Let's just say those 8 cuts. And I'm gonna look here. Just I know I'm pretty sure there's a cutting pattern in Cold Steel, and if Mark's listening, Mark will tell me what page it is. Because I don't remember and I don't mark up my books, and He does, and he probably has it marked off. So let's see. Maybe he doesn't, but either way, um, it doesn't matter. On those basic 8 cuts, that's a good place to start. Now, there's a small caveat I'm going to throw into that. People almost never, when you say cut like this, they almost never do the proper technique that should be done to do that. And keep in mind with those 8 cuts, that can be one-handed or two-handed. You want to cut one-handed and do the same cuts, you can. So there's no limitation there as far as what you do, one-handed or two-handed. That is a universal thing. So hitting a pel is typically a common thing. It's in the Milanese section. Okay, so he's driving right now, so it's in the Milanese. So let me just see. Milanese 17. Let's see. There it is. Yeah, new Mark would know. There it is. Okay. So you look at this. You see how it is the basic cuts, and he has numbers assigned with it. Basic, this is only 6, so there is no up and down cut. And in reality, I'm going to argue that the up and down cut in our sport is not an ideal. Yes, an overhead strike is an overhead strike, and that will work. But basically, the underhand doesn't necessarily work as much in our sport because you're cutting into someone's groin, which is not a legal target. But you use that cutting pattern, and you can see things like I said. I mentioned the Myers square. There's other cutting patterns out there. Find the one that feels most comfortable to you, and start to cut with the weapon. Feel the weight of it. Think about different elements of your arm, wrist, and shoulder. Um, Make sure that when you're cutting, you're looking into how it feels. You're realizing where maybe there's muscles in your arms, because everybody does it when they start out. Muscles in your arms where you are deficient. Um, there might be areas that um, don't necessarily work. Mostly use cut 7. Mark, are you referring to cut 7 like an overhead? Like, I mean, again, it's relative because I can also name a system where it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So and then literally does a 9, 10 in incorporating this Wirch, which is a out of German longsword. So which cut 7? Are we just talking about the overhead? I mean, again, I'm talking about in the universal sense. So, but either way, you should be working on that, and you should start to see where that works and where that doesn't work. One thing I talked about, I pretty sure I talked about cutting with the blade in a previous Repost and Riposte. Again, those bad habits and how to fix them is a great way to learn some simple uh, things for training. Yeah, vertically down. I get what you mean. I know what you're talking about, but I'm doing it for dramatic effect, and I'm approaching that essentially from the choreography element that I used to do, where that was like a big overhead strike. It doesn't have to be that. In reality, that's a very not a very clean strike. You're exposing yourself, you know, exposing your arms a little bit. So, and and the big thing that I would say is that you start to learn with those cuts, and then what you do from there is you start to learn the transition between the cuts. And again, I haven't even talked about walking yet. So, cutting pattern on a simple level, and I mean going slow, because you should not be going fast to start. It's just going to lead to bad techniques. You, if you can do it slow and very smooth actions, it'll feel much better, and you won't ingrain as many bad habits. Now, at a certain point, you're just doing a cutting pattern by yourself at home. There are going to be some bad habits that are going to happen. That's why it is useful to seek out instructors in your area, no matter what weapon is available to you, but the ones that interest you, and then you can incorporate them back in. Sometimes, yes, there's saber training that exists. You can do that as well. Either way, it's important to have some type of teacher, or at least a training partner, who can look for some of those issues that might happen. That, like if I cut with my hand and my hand, right, instead of the blade, instead of getting the blade out in front of me and cutting down, I cut with the hand, and I expose my hand before I bring the blade down. So that's a very common mistake that people make. So that's why it's important to go slow, because if you start going fast, you're going to notice that, like, you're just going to one thing I notice is people get really tense, they get really tight, and it just becomes like very sloppy. Um, and Mark recommends minimum use a mirror or video. Mirror is good. Video can be useful depending on the angle that you get. It's just useful to look and see what you're doing. And again, we're still just standing still, right? If we're talking about thrusting, right? Very simple, extension of the arm. And then you work on the targeting from there. And I'm not talking about a lunge, so there's no step associated with it. So, and in reality, you could stand in front of a target and go all day, right? That's very easy. You could change the targets. So if you have a Pell or some type of punching bag or whatever, a very simple stab. Mark does a tennis ball exercise that's a little harder. Um, that's a good one, where the tennis ball is on a string and it swings around. That's a really useful one, because you learn you can get better at your targeting, and you learn how to track things with your eyes. So you are getting that mind body connection a little bit, because your eyes are tracking that moving target. So the tennis ball or baseball. I've seen a baseball on a chain as well. Those are useful things. And if you want to go even simpler, you say, okay, tennis ball, I don't know that I can hit a tennis ball that's constantly moving and stuff like that. And Mark is working his way up to a golf ball. What I would say is a useful one is start with a tether ball, right? That's a big one. It doesn't require that much to, it costs 10, you can get one probably for like $10. It just usually comes with the string. You can tie the string to a ceiling, a tree, whatever, whatever's available to you. Um, it's really useful, and you can treat it just like the tennis ball, in that you can just extend and try to hit it in the center so the ball doesn't spin. The more it spins, the more you haven't hit it on target. So the goal would be to hit it on the center so it spins as little as possible, right? Um, you could do that with cuts too, if you wanted to really start working cuts and seeing, like, okay, if the target is moving, if a ball's swinging around and I make a cut, right? You can do that too. Keep in mind, you start to get a little awkward with your footwork, but with thrusting, I would say, you know, tetherball, tennis ball, or baseball, um, or and then yeah, down to golf ball. Those are probably the best options. Although with the golf ball, I think with our weapon, it might be a little bit harder for it to make proper contact. I could be wrong on that, but because I haven't tried it, but it seems like the slippery nature of the golf ball might be less than ideal. I'm wondering if a smaller ball of a similar type would be better. But the one advantage of the golf ball, it does have good. It's nice and dense, and the hard nature of it, as opposed to a soft nature, it'll bounce less. So it's sturdy enough that it won't cause a problem. So, but yeah, that's one thing that can be done. You don't have to build. I would strongly suggest somebody have a target to hit, but you can get something as simple as a tether ball, a tennis ball, and start working with that. So that is kind of like me talking about cutting. Um, but it kind of gets, but that it kind of gets to a certain concept when I was saying about tools and not rules. I say to do these cuts, right? That the reason being is that I can pull that from how many different martial arts and say, okay, here are the basic cuts, and they are universal. So you can start with that, and then you can start to incorporate style with that. You don't have to say like, I want to, I only want to do this style, right? Even if you're not necessarily it's geared towards your body. Because that's the big thing. It's like some people are going to say, well, two-handed cuts feel great for me. But then the next person's going to be like, well, I only really feel comfortable doing that with my right arm. Um, and there is no wrong answer to that. So the response would be to cut, work on those cuts from both options, one-handed and two-handed, to train and to feel which one, after you've gotten a little bit of training, you get a little bit of muscle memory, your muscles get a little bit stronger. You can start to feel what you're going to do, what's going to feel comfortable. I learned a one-handed style. Now I train in rapier outside of LED Saber, but now I do kind of a two-handed. We've called it two-handed rapier, where I am treating the two-handed weapon similar to a one-handed weapon. So I'm incorporating longsword and rapier and side sword into this kind of combination thing, and maybe a little bit of saber single stick there. But I can switch between those styles fairly well. But that doesn't work for everybody. So are you comfortable holding a saber one-handed, and making contact and holding up to, somebody try to knock your saber out of the way? You may or may not. That's an important thing to learn. I would hate for someone to say put in weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of effort as a one-handed, training one-handed, to only feel that they're not comfortable actually sparring with someone who one-handed because for whatever reason. I would say don't give up because that's how it happens for all of us. We all get our butt whooped at the beginning. I was not necessarily good, but I stuck with it. I kept going, and I got to a point where I would call myself adequate. So that's a big element. I'm just gonna get some water here. And I know I get a little rambly on these topics sometimes, so thank you for bearing with me if you're listening. Um, it's just the key thing is that I don't like prescribing specific things to do because it's different for every person. If I was assigning cutting patterns to every single new person that came through, I would be every single, let's say every single person I've met, if someone came into my, to my charter, I would talk to them about that. I would work through it, but I would make sure that for them, what is comfortable, right? I make sure that that's a comfortable action that they can perform. Um, so the same thing goes with footwork, and I will say footwork is probably infinitely more important in this context. And as Mark says, sword fighting is inherently uncomfortable. There's nothing comfortable about it. It is forced discomfort. Is most sword fighting. So I will say that you need to, with footwork, it becomes even more important to understand and know your body. If you're not physically active moving into this, it doesn't matter what your state of physical activity is, or your state of physical ability is, but lack of physical activity, regardless, is it can be difficult to listen to your body and what your body's saying. There are certain things that people may or may not be able to do. So it's important to understand how is it when you're walking, right? Because that's an important thing. You should approach what's comfortable, almost similar to how you walk, right? Because if you walk in a specific way that's unique, you're compensating probably for something, maybe let's just say a lower back injury or something like that, or a previous lower back injury, and it just kind of always nags you. So with footwork, what I will say is important is one, that you are comfortable doing it. So people talk about, oh, you can stand, in profile in a one-handed, and you're like this, and you're going to move in. That is comfortable for some people. For other people, it might not be. And I don't mean, I'm not trying to say people should be overtly comfortable. What I'm saying is that you need to account that each person is slightly different, right? So any of these techniques can be done by anyone, but there might be certain degrees of modification. So modify where you need to, and then see how successful it is, and then modify again based upon the degree of success that you find. So walking is an important part to understand that what the biggest thing I would say is that learning how to make a small step possible, right? So people say do footwork drills at home, right? Stand in front of your TV and do footwork drills. That works great. I'm not going to deny that. Do it in front of your office if you have a I mean, if you have a public if you have like a cube or something like that and you don't mind people looking at you, that's fine. Or but I do this well when I was in an office. Um, I did this stuff all the time where I would do different footwork drills, and very basic ones. I mean, I'm talking just forward, back, maybe some slight turns of my body, and just feeling that and getting more comfortable with very small but technically precise steps. It's an important element because if you don't incorporate those small steps, because I will say the big thing I notice with most people when trying to create a training exercise for themselves, they their footwork is gigantic um, in the context of a fight, right? You don't need to be taking full dramatic steps forward. You should be taking small as possible, forward, back, to the side, and then as you work and start learning and fighting more, the distances will change. Sometimes you'll step bigger, sometimes you'll step smaller. But the important thing is that the smaller steps become so much more useful because once it really starts becoming a game of inches where their blade is an inch away from striking you or your blade is an inch away from striking them, the littlest bit of footwork that you can add to a phrase or a move can mean the difference between getting hit as a defensive or you making the hit as an offensive. So that's an important thing to approach with your footwork. Now, footwork is also going to vary greatly depending on what style, because there are a lot of different style, but to a certain degree, certain footwork is universal again. But the other thing that is important is, are you fighting in a one-handed or two-handed style? So I'm assuming that a person who is new to this is going to come in and they're going to fight one way. They're not going to learn both at the same time because that might be too much for them at that point. They're going to gravitate to the one that's closest to their comfort area and they're going to approach that. I started learning one-handed, continued with one-handed weapons, and then transitioned into a two-handed style, and I would recommend that. Would I say people now need to learn a two-handed style? No, because there's definitely examples of people who can be successful in our sport and fight one-handed. As we have said, I don't know if we said it on any of the shows, but at TSL 5, we had three fighters who fought primarily one-handed, no two-handed techniques, right? Three of the top four fighters. So, we had first, second, and fourth. And that was the first time in TSL that happened. It was the first time that somebody won a tournament who fought in a one-handed style. It was the first time in second, I think, as well. I think there was someone who won with a somewhat one-handed style, but not primarily. So I think that was the first time in TSL history where we had all of these top fighters in a one-handed style. So it definitely is a shift in the meta. So that's something to think about. Consider that, but consider also, what are the advantages of two-handed versus one-handed? Well, two-handed you have better defense, right? Stronger defense, right? Because you can use that. And I know Mark's going to argue some semantics with me, but you typically have a stronger defense, right? Just from a pure muscles in your body, right? You're using more muscles in your body. Um, okay, yeah, Nick at TSL 2, and he did two-handed at the end. Yeah, that he came in third in the Saber tournament, and so he was the only one that had placed with a one-handed style a little bit, but then he changed to two-handed. So again, he was more of a hybrid as opposed to strictly one-handed. So that's why things did kind of change this year. So, um, what was I getting at? I lost my train of thought there. But basically, the thing to think about is that yeah, two-handed style. You're gonna have better defense, potentially more power. But you lose distance because from here, holding a weapon with two hands versus one hand, there is a distance thing. So you're going to lose some reach. You can reach much farther with one hand than you can with two hands together. Mechanically, that's yeah how Mark puts it. Two-handed has more mechanical advantages. With one-handed, you're gaining distance, you're gaining time. Um, Sometimes you're gaining more maneuverability because it takes less effort if you know how to do it right to manipulate. With two-handed, you definitely are using mechanics a little bit more. So that's a thing, a consideration to take into account. So beyond that, I would say that you want to look at you want to look at what is comfortable, what do you think you're going to be successful with, right? Because keep in mind, if you're doing this and this becomes your hobby or one of your hobbies, you can always modify and change. You could fight for two-handed for a year, and you go to TSL 6, and Mark's there, and you start talking to Mark, and Mark talks your ear off for 3 hours about a one-handed style, and you're like, you know what? Yep, I'm switching out. That's important though, because now you are learning a one-handed style, and maybe you'll find that that's your new style, primary style, or maybe you'll find that that's just a useful tool to use in your two-handed style. And keep in mind when I'm talking one-handed versus two-handed, I am not talking about any specific sword art. I'm not saying that you need to fight a two-handed longsword or kenjutsu or kendo or whatever you want to grab it from. I'm not saying in a one-handed style you have to fight in a military saber or an Italian side sword or anything like that. I'm strictly talking about the basic differences between the different styles that you can find and gravitate towards the style that suits you. For some people, they look at historical European martial arts and they're like, that is not something I want to touch. I want to go with more traditional martial arts, out of Asia, um, or other countries, depending what you want to learn. But for most purposes, most people tend to gravitate towards, say, like, you know, Kenjutsu, or they gravitate to Kendo or something like that. Maybe that's what they want to do. Go ahead and do that. I can't speak to specific elements of it. I just know that some of the basics do cross over. So that's another thing to consider is like what interests you, because in my opinion, you shouldn't go down a path of something that doesn't this part of this should be fun. Yes, this should be difficult. It should be something you've not done before. It should be uncomfortable, as Mark called it. It is by nature, it's inherently uncomfortable, but you should also be enjoying the journey. So you need to enjoy the journey that you're taking. So make sure that it's not something a style that you despise, that it's going to make you, in 6 to 8 months, it's going to make you hate the sport and then leave, because we want to stick around as long as we can, right? We want to, and not even necessarily just fighting, but we want to be part of the community, right? So making sure that what we're learning is something that we enjoy, right? And if you aren't enjoying what you're doing, how can you find that joy? Making sure, because sometimes, you want to take classes from someone, right? And a lot of times we say, well, in your area, what can you learn? And learn that, right? So if you want to learn rapier, but the only thing around is longsword, I would recommend taking the longsword, right? Because you never know. You go to a school like that and you say, hey, does anybody do rapier? Maybe there's some people that do it on the side, and you start a study group and then you start learning that. There's all kinds of avenues that you can go to learn more. And I'm not just saying, go to a school and learn everything you need to learn. But I am saying that is a path of faster advancement. There's only so much you can do from home um, with solo training. Um, Another thing I'm going to recommend for solo training, it just depends what you want to do. Look up, there's a lot of good resources online. There's some bad ones too, but there's some good resources online that you can find. And like people like I'll say Guy Windsor is a good example of someone who has a lot of good material out there, whether that be videos. I know he does online courses. um, David Rawlings out of London Longsword. Those are people, different people that have done really interesting deep dives into certain weapons and things. But there are things that you can apply, right? And it's just a lot of times, that's if that's something you're seeking and you don't have access to people, sometimes that's the best thing, because um, you want to make sure that you know you're enjoying what you do. So hang on one sec here. Something Greg is saying. I feel one-handed is something to work up to, especially if you have any physical ailments. One-handed is surprisingly harder on joints and core and spine. Most definitely is. So some of that, it all depends on, again, it depends on you. If, in Greg's case, he's saying, one-handed may not work for him, and he needs to work up to that, then you start with two-handed and you work your way up from there. There's no reason you need to do one-handed. Um, Now, the other thing I will argue though is, even if you have physical ailments, right, you can learn one-handed, and the training might be slower than if you were learning two-handed. If Mark is the only instructor around, and this isn't Mark, because I know Mark would teach two-handed if he was asked, and he has enough experience. If he's the only one around, he says, "This is what I teach, and you're welcome to join us," and everything. I would say still do it. If that's the only thing around and you want to get expertise from someone more knowledgeable, learn from that person. Your progress just might be slower, right? Maybe because of physical ailments, it takes you 4 times as long to get, with where you want one-handed as it would two-handed. And that's okay, right? You don't have to be moving at this lightning pace. We all want to be championship level fighting tomorrow, but you have to take the preliminary steps, and you have to slowly climb that mountain. And if you don't, you're basically going to either do one of two things. You're either going to burn out and you're going to leave, right? Um, or you're just going to, you know, that's the main thing is that's going to happen, is you're going to burn out um, if you don't wait the time it takes, or the burnout, or sometimes you'll just get frustrated and angry and bitter, with either with yourself or with other people or instructor or whatever it is. But that's kind of another thing that can happen. Like, people think like, why am I not there yet? Why am I not at the level I want to be? Um, the main thing is that when you're going on a new journey, you don't know where it's going to take you. You can look at TSL and you can say, okay, well, the best people are here, and they're winning TSL 5. They're winning the championship series belt, right? They're winning this stuff. They're doing these things. I need to do exactly what they're doing. But their journey to get there is going to be dramatically different, even if you're similar in so many different ways. The journey to get there is going to be different. I could tell people my journey, but my journey is going to be different. And the problem is, you could take the same exact steps I took on my journey and still end up with a different result, whether that be better or worse. Let's see. Learning theory is more important than specific style, one or two-handed. I mean, that's the key thing. And that's why I say it's important to learn these things to see what is important and exciting to you. So you're not stuck in this, oh, why do I got to learn this, right? Um, right now I'm learning Kappa, Ferro, Raper, and Dagger. I don't necessarily love it. I don't. It's not really a style that I'm enjoying, right, to a certain degree. But I've done this long enough that I know that there are things I'm learning from it, specifically about timing, specifically about my more subtle ways to manipulate distance. And I think that's useful, and I can apply that to other parts of my training. And most training I do is to inform my LED Saber training, right? Even if it's not, one to one applicable. So that's an important thing, is that the theory that you can learn is very important, which is why we recommend all of these books and these curriculum and everything. So you can look at them and say, all right, I'm looking at cold steel, and this makes some sense, but this doesn't really apply and stuff like that. Skip over that stuff, right? There's stuff that doesn't apply. There's stuff that's going to be, I mean, let me, I said don't follow my journey exactly, right? And no one will, because it's my unique journey. But one thing I did that I thought was exceedingly useful for me was I went to a lot of different, uh, I don't know if we technically call them conventions, but we'll just say tournaments, and HEMA tournaments where they had a lot of classes, from different people from different disciplines. And I took a lot of different workshops on different things that sounded interesting to me. I learned a lot of different things that I can't necessarily apply everything, because in those 1 to 2 hour classes, you really only learn like one or two things, and it's really like a taster to get you involved in the next step. But there's different things I learned there that I could grab one little tool, and be able to incorporate that. So it was an interesting discovery way to discover things. So that might be one way to find the elements of the sport that interest you, right? Because right now, for example, right, like what are the things that interest me about the sport? Right now, for example, me, I am very much into the physics of how the blade handles, when incorporating historical techniques. What I mean is how it differs. The bounce and slip of the blades that we use, how does that handle compared to, say, the longsword, if I'm doing a longsword technique, or how does that compare to a rapier? And knowing those differences and understanding how to modify historical techniques to make them successful, right? Because they do need modification, because they are not one-to-one transferable. There are things that require more of a bind in a blade, with a metal against metal, that you cannot perform with our weapons because it'll slip, and then you don't have as much of a guard, so you have to be mindful of that. So there's certain things, and the physics of it is something that I'm finding really interesting, right? And that's what I'm finding interesting right now, and that keeps me engaged about the sport. And I do also enjoy talking on these shows, and then analyzing and talking about all these different stuff, to help people. But that's something that I am excited about. So I talked about a lot of different things here, and I'm gonna wrap up because I only have so much time, because I do have a physical therapy appointment, a virtual appointment that I have to do. So, and so I'm going to, just kind of sum up here, because I talked about a lot of stuff and went over a lot of different things. But on a basic level, and then, like I say, next week I'll talk about some very basic drills that I would recommend, right? And it's going to be kind of more what I talked about this week, but you'll see it physically. So the first thing is, work on cuts and thrusts, right? And thrusts, right? Don't just work on cuts. I'm going to emphasize that, because I think that's an area where a lot of people suffer. Is they become so ingrained that they can only cut with this weapon, that when they thrust, their thrusts are either uncontrolled, dangerous, or just bad and easily handled by their opponent. So I'm going to say cuts and thrusts as a basic tool of training offensively, right? And notice I didn't even talk about guards. The reason I'm not talking about guards is because we're talking about simple training exercises, mainly ones you can do at home. Yes, you can do guards and you can do parries and things like that. But the problem is, without the feedback of someone actually trying to make contact with you, there's only so much you can do, without being detrimental, because you might not know you might be missing something or forgetting something. So I'd hate that you are working on an overhead parry and learning how to block your head here, right? And you're doing this and realize you're doing it wrong the first time you try to block somebody, and you just take a shot right to the head. So that one is a little bit more of a partner drill. So that's why I skipped over that section. The next thing would be footwork. Um, how can you walk? Are you doing one-handed or two-handed style? And then learning how to walk in that with the smallest steps as possible. So whatever footwork you're going to do, as small a step as possible, and then you can dramatically expand it. It's much harder to do those small steps than it is to just do the whatever your body is like saying, like, oh, just step this much, like when we walk. But if you notice when we walk and we're slowing down or something like that, we'll start to take smaller steps, right? We'll do different things. In this case, try to do smaller steps as a way of learning that sometimes all it takes is the smallest step to get the biggest advantage. So that would be the next thing. And then from there, it would be looking at different sources to find the style that is most conducive and fun for you. So finding the fun would be a big element of that. What what interests you, what engages you about it, and go from there. So you use those three things to build training exercise. So you say, okay, I want to learn a long sword style, right? So why don't I look up someone doing long sword cutting pattern, in Fiore, right? I could Google that. I can find the basic cuts in Fiore. I could do that and find the basic cuts um, in let's just say like Meyer, right? I can look at those different things. Have something to hit was another thing that I mentioned that was important. Having an object that you're actually making contact with is important. It is, yes, air exercises, hitting an air can be useful for working on your technique and your form, but it's not going to be, you're not going to get all of the physical feedback that you want when you actually strike something. So making a pel or other target like that is important. So of those things, you take that and you basically go out and you try to train for the next meet. And then I also mentioned going to different workshops and learning what interests you. So there's got to be something in your area. Even sport fencing is useful. The footwork and things like that. Not everything, but there's something elements of it that are useful if you want to apply them. And it maybe that interests you, and you use that, and then you incorporate it into this sport. That's why we always talk about taking what you've learned. Um, yes, you could always just learn Saber and go from there, but in my opinion, having some type of information outside of the LED Saber or brought in to adapt to the LED Saber is going to be infinitely more valuable for you because learning how to adapt that is an important skill to as far as I mean, I think it's an important like mental skill to learn. But on top of that, I think it's just important to understand kind of where you come from. Um, rather than just being ingrained in this is the Saber curriculum and these are the form like because the big thing is I talked about the forms, right? And people have done different adaptations of form 1 and form 2 and all these things, right? but the but the problem is that they can say, okay, we grabbed these things and we made it into our own form one. That works great, right? But in my opinion, a lot of times is it doesn't emphasize the same importance as say when you're learning something that like, oh, these are cuts out of Hutton and Cold Steel and he's from the 19th century, right? That's an important that gives a little more weight to it, right? If it has some historical value. Um, this is, this is out of kendo, and this is an art that is this many, 1,000 years old, right? Again, I'm not an expert there. I'm just using it as an example to counterbalance that I'm slightly, I lean towards HEMA, historical European martial arts, but you feel like there's history there, there's weight, there's value, and there's decades or centuries or millennia of experience that can help inform. So it's not that like, oh, this person is saying to cut with the saber this way, right? It's not, oh, this person is saying to cut with an LED saber this way because they learned long this out of longsword and this is from Fiore and Fiore, you know, emphasize these things. And that better informs you. I think the more informed you are, the more successful you're going to be. And in my opinion, the more engaged. At least for me, that keeps me more engaged to know that there is history of this being done, scrutinized, and worked on. So that's just my little rant about that. So So, like I said, next week I'll talk about some very basic things that I do out of the arts that I've learned, but I'm going to emphasize that people should do research and find what interests them the most, because what I've learned might be interesting to some, but isn't necessarily interesting to others. So, if there are any questions, I will give a minute or two. As I said, I have a hard out with a physical therapy appointment in about 15 minutes, so I have to get ready for that. And it's going to kick my ass because I've been doing pull-up bar stuff, and and that is not easy. That's a new thing for me, as I actually bought a pull-up bar, and I'm working on that and working on rehabbing my shoulder a little bit, which isn't horrible. It's more just making it stronger, because it was a little weak. Not injured, but fortunately, but just a little weak. Um, so I got to prep for that. So I don't see any questions coming in. So I'm going to wrap up and say, I think it's just going to be Mark and me right now, doing Quarantine TV. And we'll see if we can convince some other people to do some shows. We have some stuff in the works that people have been talking about. And maybe that'll happen in the future. And I know that this Saturday we have Underground, which is the episodes, the fights that we filmed at TSL 5 on the Sunday after all the tournaments had ended. So that should be a lot of fun. I'm going to be on commentary. Thor is going to be on commentary, and I think we have Eric Halston, who is the commentator for a lot of TSL 5. So that'll be a lot of fun, talking about those fights. There actually are really some great fights. I'm going to emphasize that because I was there filming them. There are some really great fights that take place, and most of them pretty much were pretty even keeled as far as skill level. So some good matchups. And that's the first underground where we really had people from across charters being able to do that. So watch for that. Get a that should be a great event, and that will be on Saturday. Um, I can't remember I can't remember the exact time. Why am I thinking it's 5 Eastern, but that's okay. Look it up on the Saber Legion page. Don't listen to me exactly, but that will be a fun event. And look for us just going live too on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. So that is everything. Take care, stay safe, and united through Saber.